Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Webisode. Today we're talking about one of my absolute favorite topics to discuss, and that is the American Gothic. Up until now, we've been across the Atlantic in Britain and talking about it as a kind of subversive form of literature or a secondary form in Britain. But now we're getting to the American mode, and the American mode is really specifically more widespread than the British form. In Britain, the Gothic is going to serve as this kind of one particular genre of many. In America, it really becomes part of the foundation of American literature. People such as Leslie Fiedler, in his great work Love and Death in the American Novel, is going to contend that American literature is part and parcel. That is, it is enraptured with the idea of the Gothic. You can't separate American literature from its Gothic basis. So, for instance, the first American novelist, full-time professional major novelist, was Charles Brockden Brown. Some of you, I hope, who were in the novel course in the spring will remember Charles Brockden Brown, famous for writing novels such as Edgar Huntley. He, in the 1790s, is going to initiate the American novel, and all of his novels are strongly influenced by the kind of Gothic themes and motifs we've been looking at so far this semester. So, it wasn't a response to something else, it was the origins of the national literature. Savoy's introduction to the book on the American Gothic that you are reading, Eric Savoy, a little bit complicated, so you may have struggled a little bit technical in its terminologies, but I'm going to try to guide us a little bit through his major point, and try to take away something from this. Essentially, throughout the 19th century, the Gothic will keep coming back among all of our major writers. For instance, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and you'll read Hawthorne before the next lecture that you watch. Hawthorne, absolutely dedicated to the Gothic, and his writing is saturated with these Gothic overtones. Herman Melville, especially in his novel Moby Dick, there is a great colossal monster that is being taken on, and the mysteries of the sea. And then finally, Edgar Allan Poe, of course, who we will discuss in the second half of this lecture. First, why is the Gothic so important to American literature? What is it about America that makes that possible? Well, there are a number of things. The first is America is a kind of land of mystery. It is the new world, so to speak. So, as we've seen, the unknown is something that is dealt with for a long time in American culture. The frontier itself, that is the closing in which we knew the entire nation as a whole or could imagine it as a totality, really doesn't become finalized until the late 19th century. So that is until the 1890s. There's always a little bit of mystery, of intrigue, the unknown, the exciting possibilities. But even it's exciting, but on the other hand, that is a terrifying aspect of America, that there's always some dark, unknown space. So for Hawthorne, that's going to be the woods in Massachusetts, the kind of border of civilization, and what's in the woods. We'll have to wait till next time to find out the dark, shadowy things that are lurking in the woods of Massachusetts. But that is always part of it. Dealing with the unknown is part of the American Gothic. Savoy is very interested also in how literature in America has a very particular characteristic that lends itself to Gothicism. And he wants to talk about illusion and allegory. Allegorical writing, as most of you probably have some idea about what that means. Allegorical writing is when something stands in for something else. So if you see some kind of symbol, some kind of moment or object, behind it is supposed to be some larger social theme or concept. But we won't deal with the concept directly. It's going to be suggested by looking at the object. So, for instance, something like in Moby Dick, Herman Melville's great American novel, you have the white whale, who is notoriously a very slippery, hard to define, hard to comprehend symbol or allegory for something else. For some people, it's going to be an allegory for colonialism or the expansion out into the world. For some, it's going to have to do with Melville's deep and disturbing past that he's trying to come to terms with. For some, it's just a larger allegory of Western progress and where the line can be drawn and man can know no more. And we've seen this, of course, with Frankenstein and the Castle of Otranto. It is Captain Ahab going to do battle with the unknown and claim mastery or complete control over this unknown, mysterious, unknowable terrain. So, here, this allegory of the white whale can undergo a certain kind of Gothic turn, and it does by its very nature. Because in order for an allegory to work, something must be repressed. And this is Savoy's larger point. There's always a process of repression and a return from repression that is involved with any act of allegory for it to work. Because if you have an allegory that does not have repression, then it isn't an allegory because you're just saying the larger context. But also, if you don't have a return from the repressed, if you don't have this kind of haunting, this return of the thing that has been hidden, then you don't understand the allegory, and a whale is just a whale. So, this is really, I think, the central tenet of what Savoy is trying to say, and I hope that you can understand a little bit of this. At the heart of it really is American literature is going to be full of symbolism and allegories. In some ways, it's trying to grapple with the new world. What is this new continent with these? We don't know. It's a blank slate. What are Americans going to be? And so a big way of understanding America, the new land, the unknown land, is to do it through these allegories. For Melville, the white whale. For Hawthorne, if you've probably read The Scarlet Letter in high school or in another English class, that crimson letter, or the Scarlet Letter, but the color of blood that fills that novel. These things act as allegories for larger ideas about the American nation, the early rising nation. But it's never overt. It's always slightly hidden, ghostly, monstrous, kept repressed under these kinds of allegorical things. So a natural tendency in America right away are the themes we've been discussing with the Gothic. Now, another early practitioner of this Gothic phenomenon in America, Edgar Allan Poe, who I'm sure all of you have heard of. You've probably read The Raven at some point in your career, in your life. And it's to Edgar Allan Poe that we turn next. In particular, we're going to discuss the black cat, because the black cat, like the white whale or the scarlet letter, the black cat is going to be a very scrutinized, widely studied allegory for some larger repression within American society at that time. So before we get right into that, let's begin with Edgar Allan Poe. There are a few things I want to note about Poe that you need to know about him before you can have any kind of larger conversation about his writing. The first is Edgar Allan Poe was a notorious alcoholic. And the main character in The Black Cat, as we know, is a very prone to these deep and terrifying freaks of passion where he is imbibing alcohol. Poe himself, and this is actually how he died, he mysteriously went on kind of a drinking spree, and we're not sure exactly what happens, but he eventually is found dead. So, in his blood, in his DNA, his parents were both, or his father and his grandfather, and all the way through, it is a disease that runs through the Poe family. So, alcoholism plays a major part, and it is in some way a sense of a lack of self-control that's really counter to a lot of the American ideologies of the time. You can think maybe of the Puritans of New England being a prime example. It is not acceptable in American society, or in Poe, he's belonging to or trying to belong to the gentry of the South. There is a certain weight placed on being, having good manners, being civilized, being repressed. And Poe sometimes is anything but repressing his passionate side, and so alcohol makes him kind of a monstrous figure in the American literary scene. Another thing that's relevant to note is that Poe was adopted. His parents were actors who eventually died at a young age, and he was adopted by another family, John Allen's family, and this is where the Edgar Allan Poe comes from. John Allen adopts him, but they have a notoriously strained relationship. Allen is a little bit of a disciplinarian, but Poe is also a rebel, a problematic child who's throws tantrums, is a little bit overly dramatic, and tends to demand more and more money that he then uses to drink or gamble or engage in other kinds of nefarious activities. So, John Allen helps us to understand the issue of fatherhood in The Black Cat. As the analysis that we read for today of The Black Cat states, and I hope you enjoyed this. I think it's an amazingly well-written and clear analysis of the story. It says that Poe himself would have been, this is on 119, aware of the dehumanizing effects of antebellum family government, antebellum meaning before the Civil War. He was well aware of family politics and how these things can be corrosive or problematic, and he himself encountered that in his struggles with his father. Ultimately, they become so estranged that they just don't speak to each other ever again. So, that might help us to understand a little bit as well about the abuses of the father that take place in The Black Cat. And finally, something worth noting, that those of you who would continue to study Poe, and if you are in the American literature class in the fall, we're going to have Poe week, a whole week of Edgar Allan Poe. We're going to read some of his stories. We're going to talk about his dastardly deeds. An amazing, amazing, and troubled figure in history. But one thing that has to stand out when we talk about the American Gothic, and here's why Poe is such an important figure in the American Gothic too. He hates all forms of mastery. He's a rebel by nature. He doesn't like people who are certain about things. He distrusts and really adamantly dislikes anyone who says, I am very certain of this, that, or something else. Hates people who are certain. And as a response, a lot of his stories are about figures who cling desperately to their sense of mastery, to their senses of certainty, but who watch as that slips from their fingertips, and the things that they try to master overcome them. Very Gothic, very American. Captain Ahab, in his final struggle with the white whale, he cannot master it, and so it destroys him. Likewise, the father figure in The Black Cat believes that he can, through his reasoning, through his thinking, that he can master the guilt that he feels of this supernatural event of the cat returning. But ultimately, as we know, he cannot master it, and so it masters him. So that's part of Poe's DNA. He's going to further analyze this position or this worldview. He's going to call it the imp of the perverse, and he writes a famous essay on this topic. And that is that we do what we know we should not do. We have a tendency to want to do what we know we shouldn't do. This is very, very common in Poe's narratives and in his personal life. He believes that we tend to be perverse or fallen creatures that do things even though we know we should not do them. We find pleasure in things we shouldn't find pleasure in. And certainly this is true of the father in The Black Cat. He knows full well at the beginning he's an animal lover, a peaceable man, but finds pleasure in doing something he knows full well he should not do. Okay, let's talk then a little bit about this story. At its most intriguing is an allegorical engagement with one of the major problems, one of the major things that's being repressed in America at the time, and that is the issue of slavery. Now, after reading the story, you may not have thought very much about slavery. It's not overtly mentioned. It's very much under the surface. But again, remember, that's part of the Gothic turn. If it wasn't under the surface, then it wouldn't really be Gothic at all. So, first of all, the cat is lynched in a certain way, hanging as though lynched, which was a famous and terrible crime that was committed routinely against African Americans and slaves. And this is something that continued all the way into the early 20th century. It's something Poe would have been very aware of and very likely witnessed during his time living in the South. And so the idea of the rope hanging from the tree, then the shape of the gallows, the idea of this noose and of that's a very strong symbol that leads us to read race and slavery onto the text. Another interesting thing, the story of Nat Turner, and for you historians out there, your history buffs, you should go and read more and remember who Nat Turner is, but responsible for a certain slave rebellion or uprising. In understanding Nat Turner, often people wrote about him as though he were a Gothic character. And so a lot of the newspaper accounts treat Nat Turner as though he were some character like Manfred in the Castle of Otranto. They try to figure out what he had kept, the dark secrets that were hidden within him, the dark passions. So for white Southern society, his dark side was his alliance with the enslaved people. Um, and so they see the rebellion as a kind of Gothic turn within this figure of Nat Turner. They see the Gothic forces exploding from him in a monstrous display. And so the language of the Gothic is at this time not only prevalent in the pages in bookstores, but the language of the Gothic is everywhere in the newspapers and pamphlets and journalism of the day. These kinds of stories are used to help us understand the American condition. Um, all right. Another thing that the analysis discusses that I think is very insightful and interesting way of looking at it is the connection between slaves and slavery and the keeping of domestic pets. And this was very uh, prevalent, especially in children's literature of the 19th century, that Poe would be familiar with, to help young people understand, and adults as well, or especially the female reading public, understand the conundrum of slavery. It was often said that we could connect it, or that it was connected in a fictional world, to the idea of keeping an animal or keeping a pet. Now, we can see that that fills the pages of literature at that time, but what does it really tell us about the black cat? What does it tell us about Poe's attitudes towards slavery? What does it tell us about the readers of the time of this story? Well, on one hand, there's been a certain area of scholarship that says Poe was pro-slavery, and in some of his editorial writings, you do find evidence of Poe supporting slavery, or at least not condemning it in very strong terms. And so, if we want to approach it from that perspective, there's the issue of things don't really become haunting or Gothic until the man considers his wife to be as disposable as his black cat. And if the black cat stands in for the slave, the domestic pet, so to speak, Poe could have been saying, don't confuse your pets with your family. You owe your family uh, more love and tenderness, and you need to keep those separate, because as soon as you conflate your family and your slaves, that's when the tyrannical horrors are unleashed. So that could be his pro-slavery reading of the story. But on the other side, you could see this as clearly being a story that is anti-slavery as well. The tyrannical father figure who has very little disregard for his responsibilities. He really is a kind of Manfred, Victor Frankenstein type character, in that he is oppressive and violent and cruel, and sometimes overthrown by his own passions or his own excesses. And so that could be a kind of anti-slavery reading of the story. So, where do we fall at the end? It's not certain, but what is certain is that this story allows us to realize why the American Gothic was so very important to an issue as divisive and as horrifying as the one of slavery. The Gothic served a very important function. It allowed American readers to approach their anxieties, to approach their deepest fears about this institution in a way that was safe, and it wasn't too overt. It was under the surface. It was haunting rather than too out in the open, I suppose. So let's read just a little bit on page 123. I think this says it really well. A form of the political uncanny, whereby Southerners turned the event into a Gothic horror story precisely because they were actively engaged in repressing the deeper horrors at the heart of the peculiar institution, a familiar fact of Southern life walled up in the cellar of the collective antebellum psyche. So, the act of repressing this familiar fact of Southern life, walling it up, as the cat and the corpse are walled up and made silent. But these things will not remain silent. They wail out like the dramatic cat wail that is described. They wail out into the room, and they remind us of the guilt and the horror that we cannot keep at bay. It is there, it is real, and it is terrifying. And so this, I hope, shows us how the American psyche uses the Gothic in order to come to terms with some of these more nightmarish aspects of a young society. Alright, so we will continue next time discussing the American Gothic. We're going to move into regional Gothics, talk about how the Gothic developed in New England and how it developed in the South. So for next time, you're going to read some amazing stories like A Rose for Emily, Young Goodman Brown, and we will come back to talk about the larger implications of the Gothic on the United States. Alright, until next time, thank you very much.